Canada, the True North. A comprehensive documentary. Part 1, The Land. Opening sequence. Fade in on the vast expanse of the Canadian landscape. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Arctic tundra to the Great Lakes, Canada stretches across nearly 10 million square kilometers, making it the second largest country on Earth. This is a land of extraordinary contrasts and breathtaking beauty, where ancient mountains meet modern cities, where polar bears roam the ice and cosmopolitan centers hum with multicultural energy. Canada is more than a nation. It is an idea, a promise, a collection of stories woven together across an impossibly vast territory. It is a country where wilderness still dominates, where nature asserts itself with fierce winters and spectacular summers, where the northern lights dance across skis that stretch beyond imagination. This is the story of Canada, its land, its people, its history, and its journey toward becoming one of the world's most distinctive nations. Chapter 1: Geography and the Canadian Landscape. To understand Canada is to first understand its geography. The country spans 6 time zones, encompassing forests that could swallow entire European nations, mountain ranges that pierce the clouds, prairies that roll endlessly toward distant horizons, and coastlines that measure longer than any other countries in the world. The Canadian Shield, a massive geological formation of ancient rock, forms the core of the country. This Precambrian bedrock, some of it nearly 4 billion years old, covers almost half of Canada's land area. Scraped smooth by glaciers during successive ice ages, the shield is dotted with countless lakes and rivers, creating a landscape that defines the Canadian wilderness experience. Here, in the boreal forest that blankets much of the shield, spruce and pine stretch to the horizon, interrupted only by the glimmer of water. Moving westward from the shield, the landscape transforms dramatically. The interior plains spread across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, forming Canada's breadbasket. These prairies, once home to vast herds of bison and the indigenous peoples who followed them, now produce wheat, canola, and other crops that feed much of the world. The sky here seems larger than anywhere else, an enormous dome of blue that meets the Earth at a horizon so distant it curves with the planet itself. Then come the mountains. The Canadian Rockies rise abruptly from the plains, a spectacular wall of stone and ice that runs from the American border northward through British Columbia and into the Yukon. Peaks like Mount Robson reach nearly 4,000 meters into the sky, their glaciers feeding rivers that flow to 3 different oceans. The Rockies represent wilderness in its most dramatic form. Grizzly bears fishing for salmon, mountain goats clinging to impossibly steep cliffs, and alpine meadows that explode with wildflowers during the brief summer. Beyond the Rockies, British Columbia's coast ranges capture moisture from the Pacific, creating temperate rainforests of towering Douglas firs, western red cedars, and Sitka spruce. Some of these trees are over 1,000 years old, silent witnesses to centuries of change. The coastline itself is a maze of islands, fjords, and inlets, a maritime wilderness where orcas hunt and eagles soar. In the east, the Appalachian Mountains extend into Quebec and the Maritime provinces, their ancient, worn peaks a contrast to the sharp Rockies. The Atlantic provinces, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador, face the often turbulent North Atlantic. Here, fishing villages cling to rocky shores, and the culture carries echoes of Scottish, Irish, and French heritage. And then there is the North. The territories, Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, comprise 40% of Canada's land area, but contain barely 1% of its population. This is the true Arctic, where the sun doesn't set for months in summer or rise in winter, where permafrost lies beneath the tundra, and where the land has been shaped by ice and cold since time immemorial. The tree line marks the boundary between the boreal forest and the tundra, beyond which only low shrubs, lichens, and mosses can survive. Canada's water resources are equally staggering. The country contains roughly 20% of the world's fresh water, held in countless lakes, rivers, and glaciers. The Great Lakes, shared with the United States, form the largest group of freshwater lakes on Earth. The St. Lawrence River creates a vital waterway from the Atlantic deep into the continent's interior. In the west, the Fraser and Columbia rivers drain the mountain snowpack. In the north, the Mackenzie River system flows through wilderness toward the Arctic Ocean. This geography has shaped everything about Canada, its settlement patterns, its economy, its culture, and its national character. Canadians have learned to live with vast distances, harsh winters, and the overwhelming presence of wilderness. The land is not merely a backdrop to Canadian life. It is a defining element of what it means to be Canadian. Chapter 2: Climate and the Canadian Experience. If geography defines where Canadians live, climate defines how they live. Canada's climate ranges from temperate to Arctic, with conditions that can vary dramatically even within regions. Winter, in particular, has become central to Canadian identity, both as a challenge to be endured and as a source of national pride. The southern parts of Canada, where most of the population lives, experience 4 distinct seasons. Summers can be hot and humid, particularly in Ontario and Quebec, with temperatures occasionally exceeding 35 degrees Celsius. These same regions face winters where temperatures regularly drop below -20 degrees, with wind chills making it feel even colder. Lake effect snow from the Great Lakes can dump meters of snow on communities in their path. The prairies experience some of the country's most extreme temperature variations. Summer days can be scorching, with temperatures climbing above 35 degrees, while winter nights can plunge below -40. The prairie winter is legendary for its harshness, not just the cold, but the relentless wind that sweeps across the open landscape, creating blizzards that can reduce visibility to zero. British Columbia's coast, protected by mountains from continental air masses, enjoys Canada's mildest climate. Vancouver rarely sees snow at sea level, and temperatures seldom drop far below freezing. But this moderation comes with rain, lots of it. The West Coast receives some of the highest precipitation levels in North America, creating those magnificent temperate rainforests. The North experiences the most extreme conditions. Arctic communities face months of darkness in winter, with temperatures that can reach -50 degrees or colder. Summer brings the midnight sun and a brief explosion of life, but temperatures rarely climb above 15 degrees even at the height of summer. Permafrost means that the ground remains frozen year-round below the surface, creating unique challenges for construction and infrastructure. Canadians have adapted to these conditions in countless ways. Winter infrastructure is sophisticated, buildings designed for extreme cold, vehicles equipped with block heaters, cities with extensive networks of underground pedestrian tunnels. Winter sports and activities are woven into the culture. Hockey, of course, is practically a religion, but also skiing, skating, snowmobiling, and ice fishing. Canadians have learned not just to endure winter, but to embrace it. Climate change is now reshaping this traditional relationship with weather and seasons. Northern communities see permafrost melting beneath their foundations. Arctic ice is retreating, affecting wildlife and indigenous hunting practices. Extreme weather events, floods, wildfires, heat waves, are becoming more frequent and severe. The mountain pine beetle, once controlled by cold winters, has devastated forests across British Columbia and is spreading eastward. Glaciers in the Rockies are visibly shrinking, threatening future water supplies. These changes are forcing Canadians to reconsider their relationship with their environment. A country that has always defined itself partly through its ability to withstand harsh conditions now faces the reality that those conditions are changing in ways both subtle and dramatic. Chapter 3: Flora, Fauna, and Ecosystems. Canada's ecosystems are as diverse as its geography and climate. The country encompasses terrestrial ecozones ranging from Arctic tundra to temperate rainforest, each supporting distinctive communities of plants and animals. The boreal forest, or taiga, is Canada's largest ecosystem, covering more than a third of the country's land area. This vast forest of spruce, pine, and fir stretches in a green belt from Newfoundland to the Yukon. It is home to woodland caribou, moose, black bears, wolves, and countless smaller mammals and birds. The boreal forest also plays a crucial role in global climate regulation, storing vast amounts of carbon in its trees, soils, and peatlands. Canada's iconic wildlife includes species found nowhere else or in few other places. The polar bear, the largest land carnivore, hunts seals on Arctic ice. Grizzly bears fish for salmon in coastal rivers. The caribou, both woodland and barren ground varieties, undertake epic migrations across tundra and forest. The beaver, which almost drove itself to extinction through the fur trade, is the national animal and remains abundant across the country. Marine ecosystems are equally rich. Atlantic Canada's Grand Banks were once among the most productive fishing grounds on Earth, supporting enormous populations of cod and other species. Though overfishing devastated these fisheries, conservation efforts are slowly allowing recovery. Pacific salmon return to their natal streams in massive runs that feed entire ecosystems, from bears to eagles to the forests themselves, which benefit from nutrients carried inland by these fish. The Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River system supports its own unique ecosystems, though they have been heavily affected by invasive species, pollution, and other human impacts. Efforts to clean up these waters have shown significant success in recent decades, with species returning to areas where they had disappeared. Arctic ecosystems, though appearing barren, support remarkable biodiversity adapted to extreme conditions. Muskoxen, with their thick coats of kiviut, can withstand temperatures that would kill most mammals. Arctic foxes, changing color with the seasons, are masters of survival in one of Earth's harshest environments. Millions of migratory birds breed in the Arctic during the brief summer, taking advantage of the explosion of insect life. Canada has made significant efforts to protect its natural heritage through an extensive system of national and provincial parks. Banff National Park, established in 1885, was Canada's first national park and among the earliest anywhere in the world. Today, Canada has dozens of national parks and hundreds of other protected areas, preserving representative examples of the country's ecosystems. However, Canadian ecosystems face numerous threats. Industrial development, particularly in the oil sands of Alberta and mining operations across the north, affects large areas. Urban sprawl consumes farmland and natural habitats. Climate change is perhaps the most pervasive threat, affecting every ecosystem in ways both obvious and subtle. The relationship between development and conservation remains one of Canada's ongoing challenges. Part 2. The First Peoples. Chapter 4. Indigenous Canada before European contact. Long before Europeans arrived, Canada was home to diverse and sophisticated Indigenous civilizations. The archaeological record shows human presence in Canada dating back at least 14,000 years, with some evidence suggesting even earlier habitation. These were not primitive peoples waiting for civilization to arrive from across the ocean. They were complex societies with rich cultures, intricate social structures, and deep spiritual traditions. The Indigenous peoples of Canada belong to many distinct nations, speaking dozens of languages from multiple language families. On the northwest coast, peoples like the Haida, Tlingit, Kwakwaka'wakwa, and Coast Salish developed elaborate cultures based on the region's abundant resources. They built massive cedar longhouses, carved magnificent totem poles, and created sophisticated art traditions. Their societies were stratified, with nobles, commoners, and slaves, and they held elaborate potlatch ceremonies that redistributed wealth and reinforced social bonds. The plateau and interior regions of British Columbia were home to interior Salish peoples, including the Secwepemc, Nlaka'pamux, and Okanagan. They relied on salmon runs, hunting, and gathering, moving seasonally to take advantage of different resources. They developed detailed ecological knowledge and sophisticated resource management practices. The Plains peoples, Blackfoot, Plains Cree, Assiniboine, and others, lived in the vast grasslands that stretched from the United States border north into Saskatchewan and Alberta. Before the horse arrived from the south in the 18th century, they hunted bison on foot, using techniques like buffalo jumps where herds were driven over cliffs. The introduction of the horse transformed Plains cultures, making them more mobile and changing their relationship with the bison herds that sustained them. In the eastern woodlands, the Haudenosaunee-Iroquois Confederacy represented one of the most sophisticated political organizations in pre-contact North America. 5 nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca formed a confederacy with a constitution, the Great Law of Peace, that influenced European thinkers and possibly even the framers of the United States Constitution. Their longhouses sheltered extended families, and their agriculture, based on the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, supported substantial populations. The Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Cree, and other Algonquian-speaking peoples occupied the vast regions around the Great Lakes and extending into the boreal forest. They lived in seasonal camps, hunting, fishing, and gathering wild rice. Their birch bark canoes were marvels of design, light enough to carry yet sturdy enough to navigate rapids and cross large lakes. Their oral traditions preserved detailed knowledge of the land, resources, and spiritual beliefs spanning countless generations. The Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and other peoples of the Atlantic coast were accomplished mariners who fished the rich waters of the Atlantic and hunted whales. They had extensive trade networks and complex seasonal migration patterns that allowed them to exploit different resources throughout the year. In the Arctic, the Inuit developed technologies and knowledge that allowed them to thrive in one of Earth's most challenging environments. They built snow houses, igloos, that were remarkably warm and comfortable. They hunted seals, walrus, and whales from kayaks and umiaks, larger skin boats. They wore clothing made from caribou and seal skins that provided excellent insulation. Their understanding of Arctic ecology, weather, and navigation was profound and detailed. The subarctic was home to Dene peoples, including the Gwich'in, Slavey, and Chippewayan. They were nomadic hunters who followed caribou herds and knew how to survive in the harsh conditions of the northern forests. Their stories, songs, and traditions encoded knowledge essential for survival in this demanding environment. These diverse peoples shared certain commonalities. All had spiritual traditions that emphasized the interconnectedness of humans, animals, plants, and the land. Many believed in reciprocal relationships with animals, where successful hunting required respect and proper rituals. Oral traditions passed down history, knowledge, and values through storytelling. Elders held respected positions as keepers of wisdom and tradition. Trade networks extended across the continent, connecting coastal and interior peoples, carrying goods like obsidian, copper, shells, and furs over vast distances. These networks also facilitated the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Population estimates for per-contact indigenous populations in what is now Canada vary widely, but probably numbered in the hundreds of thousands, possibly over 1 million. These populations were not evenly distributed. Densely populated coastal villages contrasted with the more sparse populations of the interior and Arctic regions. This was the Canada that Europeans encountered when they began arriving in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Not an empty wilderness, but a land of nations, cultures, and histories as old and complex as those of the newcomers themselves. Chapter 5: Contact in the Fur Trade Era. The arrival of Europeans in what would become Canada began a period of profound change that would reshape the continent. Norse explorers had visited briefly around 1000 CE, establishing a short-lived settlement at Elance Ox Meadows in Newfoundland, but sustained European contact began much later. John Cabot, sailing under the English flag, reached Newfoundland in 1497. French, Basque, Portuguese, and English fishermen soon were making seasonal trips to the rich fishing grounds of the Grand Banks. These early encounters introduced indigenous peoples to European goods, and tragically, to European diseases against which they had no immunity. Epidemics of smallpox, measles, and other diseases swept through indigenous populations, causing catastrophic mortality rates that sometimes reached 90% or higher in affected communities. The French were the first Europeans to establish permanent settlements and develop sustained relationships with indigenous peoples. Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City in 1608, establishing what would become New France. The French quickly realized that furs, particularly beaver pelts used for making felt hats fashionable in Europe, represented enormous wealth. The fur trade became the economic foundation of New France and shaped the colony's development. Unlike later agricultural settlers, Fur traders needed indigenous peoples as partners, guides, and suppliers. The trade created complex relationships of mutual dependence. Indigenous trappers and hunters provided furs and knowledge of the land. French voyageurs, often themselves of mixed indigenous and European heritage, transported furs via the extensive river and lake systems, using canoes and techniques learned from indigenous peoples. This partnership led to extensive intermarriage and the emergence of the Métis people, who developed their own distinct culture, combining indigenous and French elements. The fur trade transformed indigenous societies. Metal tools, cloth, firearms, and other European goods became integral to indigenous economies and ways of life. Some nations, particularly the Haudenosaunee, became powerful middlemen in the trade, controlling access to interior peoples and defending their trading monopolies through warfare. The Beaver Wars of the 17th century saw the Haudenosaunee attack and disperse other nations to secure control of the fur trade. The English, meanwhile, established the Hudson's Bay Company in 1670, giving it a monopoly over trade in the vast watershed draining into Hudson Bay, an area comprising much of what would become western and northern Canada. The rivalry between the Hudson's Bay Company, operating from bayside posts, and French traders pushing ever further into the interior, drove exploration and the expansion of trade networks across the continent. French explorers and traders pushed westward and northward. Pierre Gaultier de la Vérendrye and his sons reached the western prairies in the 1730s. Alexander Mackenzie reached the Arctic Ocean via the river that now bears his name in 1789 and crossed the Rocky Mountains to reach the Pacific in 1793. Simon Fraser navigated the treacherous river that also bears his name. David Thompson mapped vast areas of Western Canada with remarkable accuracy. The fur trade era established patterns that would shape Canada's future. It created extensive knowledge of the continent's geography and resources. It established English and French presences across the land. It created the Métis people, whose descendants remain a distinct indigenous group today. It also began the process of displacing and disrupting indigenous societies, a process that would accelerate in later centuries. French-English rivalry in North America mirrored conflicts in Europe. A series of wars culminated in the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763 with France ceding Canada to Britain. The French-speaking population of Quebec, however, remained, and the British decision to accommodate French civil law, the Catholic Church, and the French language through the Quebec Act of 1774 established the foundation for Canada's later bilingualism and biculturalism. The American Revolution brought thousands of loyalists, Americans who remained loyal to the British Crown, fleeing north into what is now Ontario, the Maritime Provinces, and Quebec. This influx of English-speaking settlers began to change the demographic balance and pushed for British governmental institutions. The Constitutional Act of 1791 divided Quebec into Upper Canada, largely English-speaking, now Ontario, and Lower Canada, largely French-speaking, now Quebec. By the early 19th century, the fur trade was declining as beaver populations were depleted and fashion changed. The Hudson's Bay Company and its rival, the Northwest Company, merged in 1821. The era of the fur trade was ending, but it had established British control over vast territories and created relationships and patterns that would influence Canada's development for generations. Chapter 6: Treaties, Displacement, and Residential Schools. As Canada evolved from a fur trading economy to an agricultural and industrial society, the relationship between Indigenous peoples and settlers changed dramatically and tragically. The fur trade had created partnerships, however unequal. What followed was a deliberate policy of displacement, assimilation, and cultural destruction. The process of treaty making began in earnest after Confederation in 1867. Between 1871 and 1921, the Canadian government negotiated the numbered treaties, Treaties 1 through 11, covering much of the Prairie Provinces, Northern Ontario, and parts of the Northwest Territories. These treaties involved Indigenous peoples ceding vast territories in exchange for reserves, annuities, hunting and fishing rights, and other provisions. The treaty process was fundamentally flawed and dishonest. Indigenous negotiators believed they were agreeing to share the land, not surrender it entirely. Many provisions were oral and never included in the written treaties. The government frequently failed to honor even the written commitments. Reserves were often located on marginal land unsuitable for agriculture, which settlers expected indigenous peoples to adopt. The assumption underlying the treaties was that indigenous peoples would eventually disappear as distinct cultures, assimilating into settler society. Métis peoples, who had established a distinct society in the Red River area, now Manitoba, were not included in the treaty process. When Canadian expansion threatened their lands and way of life, Louis Riel led two resistances in 1869-70 and 1885, attempting to secure Métis rights and land. The government responded with military force. Riel was executed for treason in 1885, becoming a martyr to Métis and Francophone Québécois, and a symbol of resistance to many Canadians. Perhaps the darkest chapter in Canadian history was the residential school system. Beginning in the late 19th century and continuing until the last school closed in 1996, the Canadian government, in partnership with Christian churches, forced Indigenous children to attend residential schools designed to kill the Indian in the child. Children were forcibly removed from their families, often for years at a time. They were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their cultures. Many suffered physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Inadequate food, poor medical care, and harsh discipline were common. Thousands died from disease, neglect, or abuse. The impact of residential schools cannot be overstated. They deliberately severed the transmission of language, culture, and traditional knowledge between generations. They traumatized multiple generations of Indigenous peoples. They disrupted families and communities. The legacy of this trauma continues to affect Indigenous communities today through higher rates of addiction, suicide, incarceration, and family breakdown. The government's Indian Act, first passed in 1876 and repeatedly amended, controlled virtually every aspect of Indigenous life. It defined who was legally Indian. It established the reserve system. It banned cultural practices like potlatches and sun dances. It denied Indigenous peoples the right to vote in federal elections until 1960, and even later in some provinces. It created the position of Indian Agent, a government official with enormous power over reserve life. The act was paternalistic and racist, treating Indigenous peoples as wards of the state rather than citizens with rights. Women were particularly targeted by the Indian Act. Indigenous women who married non-Indigenous men lost their status and were forced to leave their reserves. Their children also lost status. Indigenous men who married non-Indigenous women, however, faced no such penalty, and their wives gained status. This sexist provision remained law until 1985. Federal policy aimed at complete assimilation. The government encouraged Indigenous peoples to abandon reserves and integrate into mainstream society through a process called enfranchisement, which meant giving up Indian status in exchange for citizenship rights. Few chose this voluntarily. Economic opportunities on reserves were limited. The government controlled resource extraction on reserve lands, with Indigenous peoples receiving little benefit. Hunting and fishing rights promised in treaties were increasingly restricted. By the mid-20th century, Indigenous peoples in Canada faced poverty, marginalization, and cultural disruption on a massive scale. Infant mortality rates were appalling. Life expectancy was decades shorter than for other Canadians. Educational attainment was far below the national average. Housing on reserves was often substandard. Access to clean water, healthcare, and other services was inadequate. Yet despite everything, the diseases, the displacement, the residential schools, the cultural suppression, Indigenous peoples and cultures survived. Languages continued to be spoken, sometimes in secret. Ceremonies continued, sometimes underground. Stories were still told. Resistance took many forms, from quiet persistence to overt political organizing. The story of Indigenous peoples in Canada is not just one of victimization, it is also one of remarkable resilience and survival. Part 3. Building a Nation. Chapter 7. Confederation, and the early Dominion. By the mid-19th century, British North America consisted of several separate colonies. Canada, divided into Canada East and Canada West, roughly corresponding to today's Quebec and Ontario. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, British Columbia, and the vast territories controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company. These colonies were largely self-governing in domestic affairs, but remained tied to Britain for defense and foreign policy. Several factors pushed these colonies toward union. The American Civil War raised fears of American expansionism. The colonies traded more with each other than they once had, but internal tariffs complicated commerce. Railways could link the colonies but required coordinated planning. Political deadlock in the province of Canada, where Canada East and Canada West had equal representation despite different populations, created frustration. Britain, increasingly focused on its empire elsewhere, encouraged colonial self-sufficiency. A series of conferences in Charlottetown, Quebec City, and London brought colonial leaders together to negotiate the terms of union. The process was elite-driven, with no popular vote or broad public consultation. John A. Macdonald of Canada West, Georgetown Cartier of Canada East, George Brown, and others negotiated a federal system that would balance provincial autonomy with national unity. On July 1, 1867, the British North America Act created the Dominion of Canada, initially comprising 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. The Act established a parliamentary system modeled on Britain's, with a Governor-General representing the monarch, a Prime Minister leading the elected House of Commons, and an appointed Senate. Powers were divided between federal and provincial governments, with the federal government controlling areas like defense, international relations, and criminal law, while provinces controlled education, property rights, and local matters. John A. Macdonald became Canada's first Prime Minister. He envisioned a strong central government building a transcontinental nation. His national policy promoted railway construction, protective tariffs to encourage manufacturing, and settlement of the Western prairies. The Canadian Pacific Railway became the symbol and instrument of this policy. The government promised British Columbia a transcontinental railway within 10 years as a condition of that province joining Confederation in 1871. Despite enormous challenges, political scandals, financial crises, and the sheer difficulty of building through the Canadian Shield and Rocky Mountains, the CPR was completed in 1885, linking British Columbia to the eastern provinces. The railway transformed Canada. It made possible the settlement of the prairies. It created a physical link binding the far-flung provinces. It facilitated the movement of goods and people. The famous photograph of the last spike, driven at Craigelachie, British Columbia on November 7, 1885, symbolized the completion not just of a railway, but of a national project. Canada expanded rapidly. Manitoba joined in 1870, British Columbia in 1871, Prince Edward Island in 1873. The vast Northwest Territories were transferred from the Hudson's Bay Company to Canada in 1870. Saskatchewan and Alberta became provinces in 1905. Newfoundland, which had initially rejected Confederation, finally joined in 1949, becoming Canada's 10th province. This expansion came at a terrible cost to Indigenous peoples. The Plains peoples saw the bison herds, their primary resource, deliberately destroyed. Starvation forced them onto reserves. The Northwest Rebellion of 1885, led by Louis Riel and involving both Métis and some First Nations, was crushed militarily. The treaty process continued, pushing Indigenous peoples onto reserves and opening their lands to settlers. The government aggressively promoted immigration to settle the prairies. Clifford Sifton, Minister of the Interior from 1896 to 1905, recruited settlers from Europe and the United States. Ukrainian, German, Scandinavian, and other European immigrants arrived by the hundreds of thousands, along with Americans seeking cheap land. The prairies were surveyed into townships, and the Dominion Lands Act offered 160-acre homesteads to settlers who could prove up the land by farming it. early Canada faced challenges in forging a national identity. The French-English divide, rooted in the conquest of 1760, remained potent. Language rights and religious schooling were contentious issues. When the Manitoba government eliminated French language education rights in 1890, it created lasting resentment in Quebec. When the government sent troops to crush the Northwest Rebellion and executed Riel, a French-speaking Catholic Métis leader, it inflamed French-English tensions. Canada's relationship with Britain evolved gradually. At Confederation, Canada controlled its domestic affairs, but Britain handled foreign policy and defense. Canadian troops fought as part of British forces in various colonial conflicts. During the Boer War in South Africa, 1899–1902, French Canadians largely opposed Canadian participation in what they saw as an imperial war, while English Canadians largely supported it. This divide would recur and intensify during the World Wars. The early 20th century saw rapid growth. The wheat economy boomed. Cities like Winnipeg, Calgary, and Edmonton grew explosively. Manufacturing expanded in Ontario and Quebec. Immigration continued at high levels until World War I. Canada was developing economically but still struggled with questions of identity. Was it British, North American, bilingual, multicultural? These questions would echo through the coming decades. Chapter 8: Canada and the World Wars. World War I transformed Canada. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, Canada, as part of the British Empire, was automatically at war. The country enthusiastically mobilized, with thousands volunteering. Prime Minister Robert Borden promised a contingent of 30,000 troops. Ultimately, over 600,000 Canadians served in a country of 8 million people. Canadian troops gained a reputation for skill and courage. At the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, Canadians faced the first major German gas attack and held their position when others retreated. At Vimy Ridge in April 1917, all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps attacked together for the first time, capturing a position that had resisted previous Allied attacks. The victory at Vimy, achieved at terrible cost, became a defining moment in Canadian history. The moment when Canada came of age as a nation, proving itself capable of significant military achievement. Other battles followed. Passchendaele, the 100 Days Offensive. Canadian forces earned respect, but at an enormous cost. Over 60,000 Canadians died, many more were wounded. The war touched virtually every family and community. The war deeply divided Canada. Initially, volunteers came forward enthusiastically, primarily English Canadians. But as casualties mounted and the war dragged on, enlistment declined. In 1917, facing a manpower crisis, Borden's government imposed conscription, mandatory military service. French Canadians, who felt little loyalty to Britain and resented what they saw as an imperial war, opposed conscription strongly. The conscription crisis of 1917 reopened the French-English divide, with riots in Quebec City resulting in deaths. The war changed Canada economically and socially. Industries expanded to produce war materials. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, doing jobs previously reserved for men. The federal government gained new powers, including income tax, introduced as a temporary wartime measure but never repealed. Women gained the right to vote federally in 1918, partly in recognition of their war contributions, and partly as a political calculation that they would support pro-conscription policies. At the Paris Peace Conference ending the war, Canada insisted on signing the Treaty of Versailles separately from Britain, a small but significant assertion of independent status. Canada joined the League of Nations as a separate member. The war had been transformative. Canada entered as a colony and emerged as a nation, with a distinct identity forged in the trenches of France and Belgium. The interwar years brought their own challenges. The 1920s began with economic recession and labor unrest. The Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, where workers across industries walked out in sympathy with building and metal trades workers, frightened authorities who saw Bolshevik revolution lurking behind labor activism. The strike was crushed, with leaders arrested and immigrant strikers deported. The economy recovered in the mid-1920s, but the boom ended with the stock market crash of 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression. The Depression hit Canada particularly hard. Unemployment reached 25%. Prairie farmers faced not just low prices, but also drought and crop failures. The Dust Bowl turned parts of the prairies into wasteland. Thousands rode the rails looking for work. The government's response was inadequate. Prime Minister R.B. Bennett established work camps for unemployed men, but these were poorly received. The social safety net was minimal. The Depression challenged Canadian federalism. Provinces lacked resources to cope with massive unemployment and poverty. The federal government's constitutional powers to intervene were limited. The crisis highlighted the need for social welfare programs and a stronger federal role in economic management. World War II began in September 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. This time, Canada made its own decision to declare war, waiting a week after Britain to emphasize its independence. Under Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, Canada mobilized more gradually than in World War I, but ultimately contributed enormously to the Allied effort. Over 1 million Canadians served in World War II. Canadian forces fought in the Battle of the Atlantic, helping protect crucial convoys bringing supplies from North America to Britain. They participated in the disastrous Deep Raid in 1942, suffering terrible casualties. They fought in Italy from 1943 onward. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Canadians landed on Juno Beach as part of the massive Allied invasion of Normandy. Canadian forces fought through France, Belgium, and Holland, liberating the Netherlands and earning lasting Dutch gratitude. Canada became an industrial powerhouse, producing ships, aircraft, vehicles, and munitions. The economy, moribund during the Depression, boomed with war production. Women again entered the workforce in large numbers, and some joined the military in support roles. Conscription again became an issue. King had promised there would be no conscription for overseas service. As the war continued and casualties mounted, pressure grew to impose conscription. King held a plebiscite in 1942 asking Canadians to release him from his no conscription pledge. English Canada voted yes overwhelmingly. Quebec voted no. King eventually imposed conscription, but managed the issue carefully enough to avoid the level of crisis seen in World War I. The war had dark moments for Canada. Japanese Canadians, most of them citizens, were forcibly removed from coastal British Columbia, had their property confiscated, and were sent to internment camps in the interior. This was done without evidence of disloyalty and purely on the basis of race. The government refused to allow Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution to enter Canada, turning away ships full of refugees who were subsequently murdered in the Holocaust. World War II completed Canada's transformation into an independent nation. Canadian diplomats played important roles in Allied planning. Canada signed the United Nations Charter as a founding member. The country emerged from the war with an enhanced international reputation, a strong economy. End of the documentary. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel.